Hello and welcome to Narrative Forge Productions. In today's video, I wanted to talk about 3 of some of the most important tips that I could give to beginning writers. Now, of course, there are way more, and I'm going to cover a lot more in my videos, so stay tuned for those. But here are some of the biggest 3 that I wish I'd known when starting out with writing. So, tip number 1, write like you speak, or at least with dialogue. So, writing like you speak, that sounds very obvious, right? If somebody's reading something, you don't want them to read it as if it doesn't sound like a person talking naturally. It sounds obvious, but it's really hard to pull off. So, and this is especially important with dialogue. It is of the utmost importance with dialogue that you write like you speak, or you write like you imagine your character would speak, so it retains its naturalness. It's also important with writing in other contexts without dialogue, and especially if you're creating an audiobook or an audio drama, you're going to have a voice actor reading out these lines, right? So you want to make sure, even if that's not the case, even if it's a book you're writing that's never going to be read aloud, you want to make sure that your dialogue, especially, but also all of your writing, is written the way you speak. So a good way to go about doing this is to put yourself in your character's shoes. What would I say if I were in this situation? What would my friends say if they were in this situation, etc.? So you actually come up with reasonable reactions to things and reasonable means of dialogue. Also, if you're describing something, you'd think, how do I picture things when I look at them? So if your character's walking into a big hall, imagine yourself walking into a big hall, and then think of the key aspects that you would notice, the key things you would notice. A good way to go about doing this is to imagine you're explaining your surroundings to a blind person, and they want to know what the place you're in looks like. So with dialogue, you want to put yourself in your character's shoes and think about what you or your friend would say in that situation. With description, you want to speak as if you're talking to a blind person who's standing next to you in the situation your character's in. So that really makes you think, well, okay, so this person that's reading my book has no idea what this place looks like until I reveal it to them, because only you have the picture in your head of what you think the scene looks like. So it's like you're describing to a blind person. You're telling them what's happening, where everything is, what time of day it is, etc., so they can fully understand where your character is. Tip number 2. Don't write sparingly or sloppily. So I want to go into a little more detail on this one. And this was a trap that I fell into for actually several years before I understood not to do it. And it's something that I still fall into from time to time. And that's writing sparingly. So let's say you have this flurry of inspiration and you just want to get it down on paper. Let's say you write an entire chapter in one sitting. That's impressive. That's actually good, especially if it's a longer chapter. But let's say you have an idea for where you want it to go after the chapter, and you don't want to leave in case you kind of forget some details, so you just want to keep on writing. You will get fatigued. No writer can go for very long periods of time without growing fatigued. And what happens when you grow fatigued? You naturally look for shortcuts. And for me, the biggest shortcuts when I got fatigued as a writer was to write sparingly. So I used to write, let's say I wrote all these huge descriptions and paragraphs upon paragraphs of description and detail and metaphors and figurative language, and just really taking the time to make sure it was quality work. And then I get to, I finish one chapter and then I get to the next, and I want to keep on writing, but I'm growing fatigued. So I start using a lot of that descriptive language. I start using, in fact, language at all, sparingly. And I start making descriptions shorter. I start making dialogue shorter. And while that makes it easier for you as a writer, it has some major effects on both your reader and the quality of your book or story or whatever medium you're writing in. So you want to make sure, if you're growing fatigued and you want to keep writing, make sure that you're not sparing on anything while you do it. Or if you want, or if you can, take a break, come back to it maybe the next day or in a couple of hours, an hour, enough time to recuperate and come back at it with a fresh mind. And finally, tip number 3, use cliffhangers to your advantage. Now, when I say cliffhangers, you guys are probably imagining I'm talking about the major cliffhanger that happens at the end of your favorite show, and then you have to watch the next season to find out what happens. That kind of cliffhanger. The Hollywood cliffhangers, as I like to call them. While those are important to use and can be used effectively, I'm talking about what I like to call micro cliffhangers. And if you listen to some of my earlier episodes, you'll know what I'm talking about. A micro cliffhanger is a small cliffhanger, usually in the form of a question in my writing, but it can be anything, that gets your readers or listeners or whatever medium of writing you do, it gets your audience to go from chapter 1 or episode 1 to chapter 2 or episode 2. So you want to make sure that you have some reason for them to go from episode 1 to 2 or chapter 1 to 2. If there's no reason, then why would they bother, right? So you could put it in the form of a question. So maybe something happens to your character and they have to listen to the next episode or read the next chapter to find out what happens next, to find out if the character's okay, etc. Or something major has been revealed that your audience was curious about the whole time, so they have to move on to the next section in order to find out what the events are that follow. It could be in the form of a question, like I said before, like your character says something peculiar, and it brings about so much curiosity that they have to listen to the next episode or read the next chapter. I'm sure you understand what I mean. I'm sure you understand what I'm getting at. Micro cliffhangers are a very good way to get your reader or listener to the next part of your story. Now, it's hard to do, but this can be done solely through character building and plot. If you have an engaging enough plot and your reader or listener just has to find out what happens at the end, whether or not you put in these micro cliffhangers, or you have an engaging character arc where you have to know if the character overcomes his fear or takes on their arch nemesis, etc. If you have enough engagement like that, then that can be enough to bring your readers from chapter 1 to 2 or episode 1 to 2. But as just in case you're unsure about whether or not your plot is detailed enough for that or engaging enough for that, or you just want a safety net to fall upon just in case, then micro cliffhangers are a simple but really effective way to engage your audience and get them to continue reading or listening or watching. So, recap. Tip number 1. Write the way you speak. If you don't write the way you speak, it's going to come across unnaturally, and your reader is going to put down the book, or your listener is going to put down their headphones, or your viewer is going to turn off the TV. Because if you don't write the way you speak, dialogue's going to come across unnaturally, and so it won't sound like dialogue. And descriptions, if not written, as if you're speaking to a blind person. Again, like the example I used at the start, you write as if you're speaking to a blind person. You're describing the things that are going on to them. If you don't do that, then it's hard for your readers to imagine where your character is, or your listeners to imagine where your character is. This is a little easier to do with television. But with other writing mediums, then if your audience doesn't know where your character is, then they're just going to be confused, and that confusion is going to take away from the story for them. Tip number 2, don't write sparingly. If you find yourself growing fatigued, then take a break, or make sure that you're not taking anything out of your work. You're not detracting from your work. So make sure you're using the same amount of detail at all times. You're using the same amounts of dialogue so that there is no continuity errors in that sense. And finally, tip number 3, use micro cliffhangers and even regular cliffhangers to your advantage, because your audience will grow tired of them if you use them exceedingly in your episodes or your chapters. But if you stick to one or two, one is usually a good number, but two can be used. If you stick to a small amount for each episode, then it can be really handy tool to get your audience from one section of your story to the next. Now, I do want to add one other note on that. You want to have some micro cliffhangers going across the entire show. So let's say there's this, I'm going to use my audio drama The Mark as an example, because just so you can visualize it. At the start of episode 1, a woman comes to the main character in his dream, a dream he's having, and she says, "Be careful when dealing with the flower." And this question isn't fully answered until near the end of season 1. So this isn't an episode-by-episode question. This is a season-long or story-long question that will keep the listeners engaged, because they want to find out what exactly the flower is, what it's tied to, and other questions that may have relating to it. And so you don't want to answer all of your questions near the start. You want to have some, not too many, one or two. It's a really flexible number, but you want to keep it a smaller number. You want to make sure that you have some continuing on throughout the whole series or whole book, just to give your audience something to motivate them to keep reading or listening or watching, so they can find out what happens at the end. You do want to have some, though, that are episode by episode, so that if you have one question in episode 1 and your audience listens to episode 2 to answer that question, you want to make sure you answer it for them. Of course, some questions aren't going to get answered, like I said, until the end of the season. That is totally fine. But if none of the questions that you bring up, or none of the micro cliffhangers that you bring up, get resolved until near the end of the show or the end of the season, then your audience isn't going to feel engaged, because their questions aren't being answered. And it'll feel like a waste of time for them, unless your story is really good in all other aspects. But it will take away from your story. So you want to make sure that you have some questions being answered episode by episode, and you want to make sure that some are over the span of an entire book, or entire section of a book, or an entire season. You want to make sure they have some motivation for your listeners to listen both episode by episode, and also just to listen to the entire show. Hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully you guys learned something from this episode. I am going to be uploading more videos where I talk about how to write better. So whether you're a beginner writer or an advanced writer, hopefully I can either give you some skills to build upon, or even hone your skills if you have some already, as I'm sure most of you already do. I'm sure you guys are excellent at what you do. So without further ado, I hope you listen to my next episode. I'm sure you'll enjoy it, but I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and like and subscribe if you haven't already, because it really helps out a ton. Anyways, I'll see you in the next one. I hope you have a great day.